problems, right?
Dead birds are a bad omen, apparently.
What's that?
Dead birds are a bad omen, apparently.
Oh, really? For them especially. Um, anyway, so the populist, the Grange and these other groups start to kind of take these decisions on hand. So they create their own insurance companies, they create their own banks, they create their own cooperatives, right? The economy's kind of fluctuating, and so those don't last, permanently. But what you see around the 1890s is the successor to these initial groups like the Grange and the Farmers Alliances. The other thing that's striking about these groups is that they're racially mixed, they're desegregated, which is really quite stunning. Now, the Farmers Alliance, you actually had two. You had the Farmers Alliance and the Colored Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance had 3 million farmers. The Colored Farmers Alliance had 1 million farmers, and mostly sharecroppers and blacks, because after the Civil War, they're essentially relegated to sharecropping and agricultural work, which isn't significantly different than the kind of work they did back when they were enslaved. And I don't mean to kind of create an idyllic vision that they worked together well. There were clearly racial distinctions. But then around 1890, the populists emerged. It was called the People's Party. Okay? There's populism, which is the kind of general political idea that kind of is prevalent and is going to last for a little less than a decade. And there's the populist, which is the group, the People's Party. In 1892, the People's Party runs candidates for office. They even run a candidate for president, a Civil War general named Weaver, who said, this is a race between the classes and the masses. Think about that. The classes and the masses. What's he saying? I mean, he's referring specifically to class distinction. We don't see that in the United States. I mean, up to this point, in the 1890s, you have the Republicans and the Democrats. And the Republicans are actually the party of business and of black manumission, right? Lincoln was the president during the Civil War, so all blacks who were able to vote Republican. The Democrats are the party of working men and Southern farmers. The Democrats are essentially the party of, people the Republicans are the party of today. All these Southern farmers who hate blacks, they're Democrats in the 1890s, right? Well, in 1892, Weaver and the populists run with a clear message to farmers in the South and in the West. And it's a class message between the classes and the masses. Who has screwed you over? Is it the black farmers screwing you over? No. Is it, white workers in the North screwing you over? No. Who's screwing you over? The banks are screwing you over. The railroads are screwing you over. The government's screwing you over, right? So it's this clear race, and they do quite well. Weaver gets a fair number of votes, and then in southern states, a fair number of populists are elected, to legislative seats and even some governors and senator seats. So it's a movement of farmers that has a clear agenda and actually has some momentum. And they're gearing up in 1896, the populists are going to run for office. And they put together what is probably the most radical platform in U.S. history, and it's something worth looking at. I'm not going to read the whole thing. There are essentially a few things that are worth mentioning for them. For instance, they're the first group to call for an income tax, which nobody likes, except prior to this time, there were no income taxes. So how did the government raise money if you have no income taxes? What's that? Sales taxes and tariffs and things like that, right? And disproportionately, who do those affect? Poor people. So like in Texas, there's no state tax, right, in Texas, but you have some of the highest sales taxes in the country. And when I moved down here, I went from a place where the sales tax was 4.5% to 8.25%. And I remember the first several big ticket items I bought, I thought they messed it up because these things couldn't cost that much. It was, that I realized there's a significant tax burden, and that plays heavily upon people who are poor. All right, so they wanted a graduated income tax to kind of make that more equitable, make that more fair. But there are three other things that I want to talk about. One is this. They actually deal with currency issues, which is not the easiest thing to figure out, but we'll go over it quickly. They also wanted to create a system of regulation for banks and for the railroads. So what the populists do is actually challenge the nature of capitalism, probably more so than any political group. I mean, you had the Communist Party and groups like that, I won't mention them, but they were never kind of legitimately in the mix. The populists were The populists look around, and there are kind of 3 or 4 major enemies the populists have. The bankers, obviously, the railroads and monopolists, people they call monopolists, right? What are monopolists? What's a monopolist? What's a monopoly? Somebody gains like a dominant share, controls the entire industry, and in the 1890s, when you think monopoly, what do you think? Standard Oil, Rockefeller, and there's one more he's pretty close to. Carnegie and steel, right? So steel and oil in particular really is monopolistic. And there are different ways to organize this. You can organize it vertically, right, where you purchase everything that's necessary in that particular industry. So Rockefeller owned the fields, the oil fields. He owned the equipment. He owned the railroads on which it was, he owned the barrels. He owned the distribution centers, everything. Okay, so he controlled that. Steel's a little different. What Carnegie would do is just buy up everybody, like the Homestead or whatever. Both of them would practice, kind of, and they both had these wonderful reputations, right? But they both practiced some really kind of shady types of business dealings. One of their favorites was they would go into an area where there was a competing industry, like you're selling kerosene, and I will go in there and I will sell my kerosene for half of yours, which within months is going to put you out of business, right? Because I can afford to take that hit, right? And so what happens as soon as you go out of business? What's going to happen? What do you think? What am I going to do? I'm going to. Then what else am I going to do though? You're out of business. So what do I do to you? I buy you out for nothing, right? There's actually a case a few years ago in Germany. This was like just 5 or 6 years ago. Walmart was actually sued in Germany for doing precisely that. Walmart was selling milk so cheap that nobody was going to German department stores to buy it. So there were actually laws in Germany to protect that. And Walmart actually got sued and had to increase the price of their milk in order to not undercut and put out of business local producers, right? It's a double-edged sword. Obviously, as a consumer, you want to buy the cheapest stuff possible, but there is this kind of collective economic price to pay when you do that. So the populists didn't like monopolists because monopolists were kind of screwing everything up. They were making it impossible for them to operate on a free market. See, we keep hearing about a free market, but is it really a free market when you have these kind of monopoly or even oligarchy? What's an oligarchy? It's a smaller group. It's not necessarily a monopoly where one person does, but in an oligarchy you have a fairly small group of businesses who are going to kind of control everything, right? So today I think it's fair to say we have a lot of oligopolistic kind of things going on. In 1980, at Buzzanco, there were about 30 air carriers. There were about 30 different airlines in 1980, and they were regulated, in fact, and you could get some really cheap tickets because they were essentially competing with one another. The airlines were deregulated, I forget what year, and it went down to what do we have now, 4 or 5. There are a few more, JetBlue and others have emerged, but at one point they were down to like 4, and prices are really significantly higher now. So that's kind of an oligopoly, And oligopoly may be kind of the natural tendency of business, right? So these monopolistic or oligopolistic relationships damage smaller producers and damage farmers. They cannot compete, right? So that's their first beef. They don't like the monopolies. They don't like the railroads. Why don't they like the farmers like railroads? Why do farmers need railroads? What's the relationship? Transport their goods, right? And so, again, who will railroads favor in terms of doing business with? What kind of people? Somebody say.
Standard Oil for.
Well, industries, right? Because you can make more money. It's a guaranteed market. You're selling more goods, and so again, they will give better rates to steel, to coal, to manufactured products than they will to farmers. Yeah.
How would you consider the oil industry, but back then whenever they contracted with the railroads to drop their shipment prices so that they could outbid the other independent oil companies?
Yeah, there were actually court cases brought against Rockefeller and others for that. I mean, there was clear collusion, but there really weren't any laws against that either. So essentially what they were doing wasn't necessarily illegal. But yeah, that would be part of the deal with Rockefeller. If you want my business, you're going to give me, you're basically going to be working for me. And a lot of those railroads, Rockefeller simply took over. which meant that they weren't available to ship farm goods. In addition to that, until a few years ago, well, now with cell phones, it doesn't matter if you remember the day before cell phones, where if you had a landline, it would actually cost you more to call somebody in Dallas than it would to cost you somebody in California. They had local rates and they had out-of-state rates. Well, the railroads did the same thing. It's an economy of scale. They had the short haul and the long haul rates. A lot of farmers ship goods in a fairly local area. Like cattle ranchers, you'd ship your cattle to essentially like Kansas City or Chicago. You know, you're not sending the cows to Boston. You're sending the packing houses will send meat to Boston, but if you have cows, they're going to Kansas City, Fort Worth, Chicago. There aren't that many places they can go to, and they have to go to those places, right? So those short haul rates actually were way more expensive than long haul rates. So I mean, if you're going to sell coal, if you're going to mine coal in Virginia or Kentucky, you can sell it in Iowa, and you'll get a pretty good rate for it, right? Because you have to buy coal, right? It's a necessity, and you can sell coal anywhere. It's fungible that way, right? You can sell it anywhere. It's not like I want to say I want that bin of coal and I want to send it to Chicago. You send me some coal, right? So the farmers were also kind of being they felt economically cheated because these railroad rates were just so disproportionate. Industry was getting better rates. They had to pay more for short hauls than for long hauls, so they hated the railroads too. And above all, they hated the banks, okay, for obvious reasons. Bankers favored industry. Bankers believed in conservative loaning policies. I don't want to go back into it, but if any of you have ever studied the bank crisis of 1837 with Andrew Jackson, I mean, that's a clear case of that, where Jackson actually did try to enact bank policies to help farmers to make money cheaper. Cheaper money means people can get it, they could borrow money. And it led to a major depression when he did it. So banking is always, and you live this today, right? Who gets money? Who do bankers take care of? They take care of the wealthy. They take care of each other. The government takes care of bankers, right? I mean, I don't know how many houses have been foreclosed on. This is essentially what the bankers are dealing with as well. So they hate the banks because banks will favor industry, they'll favor manufacturers, and because it's a safer investment. I mean, you know, like I said before, if you want to expand your mining interest, you know, that's a pretty safe investment. You're going to need more coal. You're going to need more iron. You're going to need more basic resources in order to create steel or build railroads or whatever. Farming, there's a glut. There's a glut, frankly, too. That's the thing is, farming is important. People are gonna eat their farms all over, right? And most Americans are still farming. I mean, the dominant occupation for Americans at this point is still farmer. So the populist, this is kind of their trio, their bête noire, right? The monopolists, the bankers, and the railroads. And so they have a plan for that. What do they want the government to do? They demand, well, first of all, graduated income tax, which is considered quite, I mean, that's kind of when you give the state that kind of power, that's pretty far out there. That's not kind of a private market. You know, that would be considered socialist, right? What else do they want? They want the government to help farmers out because the banks won't. So they asked the government to create what they call a sub-treasury plan. They want the government to establish, the government would run them, agricultural banks, all right? Loans would be given out at a fairly low interest rate, 2 or 3%, and farmers, because they don't have resources, would use their crops as collateral. So I would be able to go into a bank, say I want to be able to, I need to buy seed, I need to buy some plows, I want to expand my holdings, I need X amount of money. I'll get it from you at 2%, and then my collateral will be what I produce, because I don't have the resources available right now to produce collateral for you, all right? So they ask for government banks, okay? And then for the railroads, it's even further. They demand in their platform that the government take over the railroads, nationalize the railroads, right? Now this is pretty far out there. Once you start nationalizing things, you've essentially crossed the line. You've gone over from, being capitalist to being something very different and very frightening to capitalism. what happens after the Civil War when the Freedmen's Bureau is established to give land to ex-slaves, 40 acres at a mule? How's that work? Not very well. Why? How long does it last, that Freedmen's Bureau thing? Anybody know? It's a ballpark idea. 2, 3 years, if that. Something like 30 to 40. There are 3.5 million ex-slaves, 3.5 million Southern blacks. 30 to 40,000 got land from the Freedmen's Bureau. Right? It was considered, it's revolutionary. I mean, if you want a quick, like, kind of cheap definition of socialism or revolution, land reform. Because when you start giving land to poor people, where does that land come from? Will Rogers' old line, land is really valuable because they ain't making no more of it. Right? So if I'm going to establish a land reform program and give land to all you poor people in here, where's that land coming from? Huh? Private property owners. And which kind of private property owners? More wealthy ones. So I'm Robin Hood, right? And so I'm taking land from there. So land redistribution and government ownership are absolutely revolutionary in the United States. The Freedmen's Bureau didn't last long. I mean, as soon as any kind of state institutes some level of land reform, the United States immediately challenges it and tries to stop it. And in the same way, saying we want the state to take over the railroads. I mean, think about that. Think about that. I mean, what does the state run anymore? The post office, and that's not long for the world. I used to say the post office is in the Army, but now you have all these private, like this pull out of Iraq that Obama was bragging about 2 or 3 weeks ago, months ago, whatever. Right? Pull out of Iraq. Does anybody know if there's any troops left in Iraq? Any Americans left in Iraq? How many? Ballpark figure.
There's less than 1,000.
No, there's actually almost 100,000, but they're not in uniform. Who are they? They're contractors. Yeah. So basically, we don't really have these state facilities or state groups or state, and that's what the populace wanted. They wanted the state to run the railroads. Now, what do you think Cornelius Vanderbilt and Averill Harriman and Jay Gould thought of that? Are you kidding? I mean, so this is a challenge, not just to tweak the system. They wanted this fundamental restructuring, right? They believed that the state should start banks just for farmers, and the state should take over railroads. The state should institute income taxes, and the state should heavily regulate monopolies. The best known of their policies, and again, this is really striking, had to do with currency and whether it would have worked or not. And there's actually a debate on that. Most people say it wouldn't have. But what's striking to me is you have a bunch of farmers in the West and in the South who, they ain't educated. They didn't go to the Bauer School of Business, or they don't have MBAs from Harvard or anything like that, like George Bush did. So what did they decide? They look at the currency situation and say, this is our problem. We are running a very tight currency monetary system in the United States. Money in the U.S. is backed by hard currency, which is called specie, S-P-E-C-I-E, all right? There's a rough kind of equivalence, a quota, between the amount of money you actually circulate and the amount of gold you actually have. And in fact, what was most money made out of in the 1880s, 1890s? It was made out of coin, all right? Paper money was tried during the Civil War, right? And what does paper money tend to do? Greenbacks. What's the problem with that? A lot of people hated greenbacks. Why? It devalues currency and it causes inflation, right? Because it's a piece of paper that's backed by currency. But as we're seeing today, is there some kind of fast and hard law as to how much paper you can produce? No. I mean, the Fed, quantitative easing, the Fed can produce $600 billion worth of money. They simply make that money available and people buy it. Their T-bills, their government treasury securities, right? And in my own opinion, that's the only thing that saved the U.S. from being in an even worse depression right now, is the fact that the government's made this cash available. That causes inflation. It's not as valuable, right? But the problem in the 1890s is there's not that much gold out there. So if there is a shortage of a particular commodity, and like I said before, this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but just think of gold as something you buy and sell. Gold is no different than an iPod. Gold is no different than a motorcycle helmet. Gold is no different than a computer. It's something you buy and sell, right? if there are very few computers out there, what's the price of computers going to be like? What's the value of computers going to be like? It's going to be much higher, right? If there's a gazillion computers out there, what's the value of computers going to be like? It's going to be much lower, right? So as a consumer, would you rather there be a lot of computers or just a few computers? A lot of computers, right? Think of money that way, all right? If there's a small amount of gold in circulation, what's that going to mean with regard to your access to money? There's not much gold out there, so what's that mean? Is it going to be easy for you to get money? All right. Now, what does that mean specifically? If you're a farmer, where do you need to get money? I mean, in the first instance, where do you go to get money? The banks. And that's what we're talking about. Banks don't have access to significant amounts of money because there's not that much gold. All right? Is that cool? Is that too complicated? And sometimes this stuff can seem really out there, so please let me know. All right? All right. I actually don't think it is. And I think that for the most part, people don't explain this in an easy manner because they don't want you to know. The folks in charge of the government do not want you to understand that you can understand the economy. That's why they say, this is too difficult, let us deal with it. We're experts, we can handle it, right? It's not that hard. I'm self-taught, and I can kind of understand it enough that I can talk about it, right? There's a short amount of gold, which means that the banks don't have that much money, which means that farmers don't have access to that money. Farmers want money, right? Farmers want cheap money. What does that mean? How can money be cheap? What's that? If there's more in circulation, it's cheaper. And again, I know that sounds weird because we're talking about money, but just think of money as a commodity. Think of it as if it's computers, if it's shoes, hats, whatever, bagels, it's a commodity. Now, if you have a gold standard and the value of your money is being based on gold, all right, how do you make more money? You find more gold. Well, that's not that easy, is it? Right? So what else can you do? What's plan B? What's that? You change the standard. If there aren't enough bagels, I start selling donuts. Right? So if there's not enough gold, silver. Okay? Why silver? Why gold? First of all, why gold? Why is gold so valuable? It's historic. People decide it looked pretty. I mean, seriously, it's that simple. You could have created a currency system based on, shale or seashells, or they did. Yeah, there have been, right? Just gold happened to be considered a valuable commodity, right? It was difficult to get at. There's a certain amount of labor involved in it, but it's not alchemy. It's not like gold had this intrinsic value where if you rub gold, a genie looking like Barbie would appear or anything like that. They decided on gold, right? Well, in the same way, you could do silver, right? There's a lot more silver going around, right? So what did the populists, these illiterate farmers who do not have degrees in economics from the Wharton School of Business, what did these farmers suggest? Well, not necessarily switch to it, add to it. They believed in bimetallism. They were bimetallic. I think their ads for bimetallism at the back of the Houston Press. Bi-curious, bimetal out. Anyway, they wanted the government to have two different currencies, gold and silver. So if all this silver is abundantly available, and now you make that a legitimate currency. Now, gold and silver aren't going to be worth the same, all right? There's a valuation of 16 to 1, all right? So 1/16 ounce of gold would be the value equal to an ounce of silver, right? But still, you would have much more silver. So and what do they call it? They call it the free coinage of silver. What would this do? If the government coined silver freely, made it available then to who? I mean, the government doesn't take money and just shout while they do if you're a lobbyist, but in the 1890s, if the government gets all this silver, the government purchases the silver, what would they do with it? Who would they give it to? Banks. And then once those banks, you hear, okay, the bank has silver. What are you going to do now? You're going to go back and ask for a loan, right? And it's going to be more likely that you'll get one because of free coinage of silver. I mean, think of this. So what are the populace demanding? think about this, they're demanding an income tax, government control over the railroads, government creation of a bank just for farmers, and a dramatic transformation of the currency system. So they were essentially saying, they weren't necessarily saying, we're going to get rid of capitalism, but they weren't fundamentally going to transform it. Right? So what happens to them? What happens to the populace? What's that? Yeah, I mean, in 1896 they were running for office and there was a great deal of optimism. And they had a convention, or no, their convention was planned. In the meantime, the Democratic Party had a convention. Now, the Democratic Party is a party of farmers, but it's a party of white farmers. The populists were also notable even more so because they actually did have a desegregated organization. Actually here in, is it Grimes County, not far from here? At one point they elected, and blacks were elected, ran for office and were elected as populists in many places. Grimes County, they elected a sheriff who was white, populist sheriff who was white, and a populist vice sheriff who was black. White mobs marched onto Grimes County and took them both out. I think they lynched them both, so that wasn't unusual. In 1896, there's a convention. The Democratic Party's having a convention, and they can't decide who to pick for president. I mean, it's a brilliant. I mean, it makes me think that it was kind of like the Republican candidates this year. Like, God, which one are we stuck with, right? And so they keep voting, and they're on like the 100th ballot. And a young guy gets up who was the mayor of Omaha, Nebraska, and he's very well known. He's a populist. He's only about 36 years old at the time, and he gets up and he gives a speech, and this speech blows people away so much that they make him the Democratic. He's a populist, but they make him the Democratic nominee for president. Anybody know what I'm talking about? What's that? Well, I'm going to show it on this anyway. So, does anybody know who I'm talking about? William Jennings Bryan. Bryan gives one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history. All right, where he talks about how important agriculture is. All right. The original speech wasn't videotaped, but Bryan continued. He lived for another 30 years. And so he would go on the road and recreate the speech for money, right? Does anybody know what Bryan's last hurrah was? What time they kind of did him in? What's the monkey trial? You ever hear of the Scopes monkey trial? There was actually a law in Tennessee that said you could not teach evolution. Now, in 1924, people laughed at that law. Today, in 2011, the governor wants that law. So we've gone a long way, right? But anyway, Bryan was actually an evangelical Christian. A lot of populists were. And so Bryan actually was defending the law, right? And he was kind of made to look a fool, and he actually had a heart attack and died. But that's neither here nor there. He would go around and raised a lot of money, became very wealthy by recreating this very famous speech he had given at the Democratic Convention. And it was called the Cross of Gold speech.
100 years ago today, in a crowded, no doubt smoky convention hall in Chicago, a century of two-party politics was more or less guaranteed. It was done through rhetoric. The issue was whether the U.S. Mint should coin silver as well as gold in order to increase the amount of currency in circulation, making it easier for debtors to pay off their creditors. Big business in this country wanted none of it, and the leaders of both the Democratic and Republican parties were solidly behind a gold-only currency. Only the Populist Party liked the idea of silver coins. But then at the Democratic Convention, William Jennings Bryan stepped to the microphone and changed American politics.
I come to speak to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. but destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what line the battle is fought. If they say bimetallism is good, but that we cannot have it until other nations help us, we reply that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore bimetallism, and then let England have bimetallism because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
William Jennings Bryan. By newspaper accounts from that day, the conventioneers were stunned by the speech. There was a moment of silence as they looked upon Bryan on the podium, arms outstretched as if crucified. Then they began to chant, my God, my God, my God, as they stampeded toward the man they would nominate the next day as the Democratic presidential candidate, effectively taking the wind out of the populist sails and ending that third party's best chances of breaking the two-party system. That was 100 years ago today. Our recording of William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech was made in 1923.
So Bryan gives this famous speech, and like I said, he becomes the Democratic nominee. What's that mean? Essentially, it kills the populist off, because he was a mayor of Omaha, at the time, by far the most famous speaker for these agrarian issues. Now, he joins the Democrats, but as kind of part of it. Now, the Democrats give him a much better platform from which to run for president. However, as part of the deal, the Democrats essentially get their pound of flesh too, and they tell the populace, you're not going to have any more black members, right? And that was really kind of one of the keystones of populism, this kind of desegregated group. One of the famous populists, Tom Watson, once there was a posse in Georgia coming after this black farmer, and Tom Watson, this guy gave him refuge at his house, and a bunch of these white populists surrounded the house, and they said, you know, we have a lot in common, black farmers, they're in the same ditch as we are. Right? A few years later, Watson became one of the nastiest race baiters in the South, and became a senator from Georgia, you know, just using this kind of racial, really ugly racial rhetoric, right? So the demise of the populists, they were integrated to the Democratic Party. Bryan didn't win it.